Is it yet? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
good afternoon.
Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome to everyone on Zoom and in person. Happy to see all of you. My name is Constance Mars Hope. My friends call me Connie, so I hope by the time we get through these next 90 minutes that you'll be calling me that as well. I'm an executive coach, trainer, and facilitator. I've been doing this for the past 18 years. Before that, I was a professor of African history at the University of the District of Columbia. In my last 3 years there, I was chair of the history department. I left the university, well, I shouldn't say I left, actually, I was riffed by my to-be husband, and I married him in revenge, as I like to say, because he was in the president's office and he was in charge of the RIF, that is the reduction in force. I was the newest and the youngest person in the department, so I had to go. But it turned out to be probably the best thing that happened to me in my professional life, because I left the university and went to the World Bank. And I worked at the World Bank for about 15 years. And I retired from the World Bank when I realized what I wanted to do when I grew up, which is what I'm doing now. And I have been doing this work for, as I said, about 18 years. And I'm loving it. It is my passion. In this work, I have worked with international organizations, again, as with the World Bank and with the United Nations. I also work with US government agencies such as the Agency for International Development, USAID, and the State Department. And in those capacities, I've been able to travel around the world. I have lived, studied, worked, and traveled in 61 countries. I am originally from Liberia. I should have said that earlier. And so I bring to this work a kind of a global view of what we do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Here locally, I do sit on the board of the Chesapeake Multicultural Resource Center. I have been involved in conversations on race here in St. Michael's and in Easton. I am the diversity chair of the American Association of University Women Easton branch. And yeah, that's about it about me. And then that's enough about me. So if you have any questions, we can talk about that later. But right now I want to get down to work and think about why are we in this room. So I'm going to advance my PowerPoint. And this is a quotation from an article that I read not too long ago, that the foundation of any collective action of any community is language. Language influences how we feel, how we react to things. Even more importantly, language influences how we understand things, what they mean to us, and how we relate to one another. I thought that was apropos for our conversation today. In an article in The Atlantic, John McWhorter said, or asked the question, has American society ever been in less basic agreement on what so many important words actually mean? Terms we use daily mean such different things to different people that communication is often blunted considerably and sometimes even thwarted entirely. The gap between how the initiated express their ideological beliefs and how everyone else does seems larger than ever. So I thought that was also apropos to our conversation today. So what are we trying to accomplish today? Here are some objectives that I thought about and see if you agree. I thought that we would discuss and define 10 concepts commonly used during conversations about race and racism. We would become more aware of how these concepts are defined and used in these conversations. We would become more aware of the importance of having a common understanding of these concepts, and hopefully clarify your own definitions of these concepts. Does everyone agree? Anybody have any other objectives for today that you'd like to add that hopefully we can accomplish? No? Okay. I'd like us to agree on some ways that we are going to be together. So we hopefully will be willing to share information, experiences, be curious, ask questions, challenge each other if necessary, or if you feel like you need to, listen to each other and be respectful, hold information you learn about colleagues confidential, be sure to take something useful away, and hopefully enjoy. And these are ways that I hope we can be together. Do you have anything else that you would add? Anybody, anything that you think is missing that we should add that would make you feel more comfortable being in a safe space? Okay, then we will move ahead. So last week, Dr. Anderson spent a lot of time, really great time talking about race and racism. So we certainly don't have to spend any time on that, but just to remind you of what she said, and hopefully was your takeaway, that race is a social construct. It's a species classification of humankind created by Europeans during a period of worldwide colonization, using themselves as the models of humanity for the purpose of establishing and maintaining power and privilege. That is a quotation from Dr. Maulana Karenga, who is seen as the father of African American studies. That's his take on it. But Dr. Anderson emphasized that race is a social construct, has no basis in biology. Racism is the belief that certain racial or ethnic groups are inferior to one's own. And I think we can accept that as well. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we're going to start with some easy words. When I say easy, we all use these words. And, you know, if you're in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, that is DEI, diversity kind of rolls off our tongues and we use it. But do we, are we all on the same page as to what diversity is? And I think this is one that we are probably closest to being in having a common definition. But I'd like you to take a few minutes to think about these questions. What is your definition of diversity and what does it mean to you? What does it look like in real life? What is an example and how have you experienced it? And I'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. So when you're ready to answer these questions, you know where the microphone is. Those of you who are on Zoom, please speak up. I hope I can see you. I can't see everybody at the same time, but if you do want to say something, please speak up. Identify yourself and speak up, and we will hear you. Okay, so just think about these questions for a few minutes. What is your definition of diversity and what does it mean to you? What does it look like in real life? What's an example and how have you experienced it? Anyone, please start.
Connie, this is Lynn from the audience. Can you hear me?
I cannot hear you very well. Who's speaking?
Let me get closer. This is Lynn from the audience. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So one thing that comes to my mind in watching the Olympics is that many of our U.S. teams are all very white. And I come from the sport of equestrian sports, and it was very similar in those sports. And we were always looking for other people of different ethnicities and race to participate. So that would be one example. And there can be all kinds of reasons why. A lot of these sports are very expensive, and they require a lot of time from parents who in less than high income ranges don't have the luxury of hauling their kids around. So maybe some other thoughts from people in the audience?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I couldn't, please, I hope, are you in person speaking, Lynn?
In the room, right next to the microphone.
Okay, because it's not coming very clearly. I don't know if any people on Zoom can hear you. It's not clear.
Honey, I think they said to get near this microphone. Can you hear me?
I hear you very well. Yes.
Okay, okay.
So that looks like we need to be closer.
Yeah, the
to
guy
the
said to
phone.
come to that
Good,
microphone.
okay.
My name's Harvey, and just another example of diversity of culture when we engage with people of other cultures, ethnic groups, whatever. Sometimes their customs are different than ours.
Mhm.
An example of mine, as an educator, I was engaged a lot with exchanges in Japan. And I learned very quickly, at some expense at some point, that certain things that I thought were appropriate in the United States were offensive in Japan. And even words, for example, the Japanese word for yes is hi, but it doesn't mean yes the way yes is in this country. For example, if you say, would you like pizza for dinner? If I answer hi, that might mean, yes, I would love pizza, but it also might mean, yes, I understand your question, but I don't particularly like it. So I think recognizing that people in around the world have different ways of viewing things and to be sensitive to that.
Okay. All right. So that's diversity. And Lynn, I'm sorry, I did not hear your question well enough to be able to respond to it. Would you like to repeat it closer to the mic?
Yes, so we found the secret here. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. So my example was watching the Olympics, and the US team is really, really white. And I kind of got thinking about that, and I come from the equestrian sports side of things, which is summer games, but again, it was the same problem, being difficult to get Blacks or certainly Hispanics, other people involved in the sport. And then it seemed as if, maybe that's an economic issue, because these sports are very expensive, and they also require a lot of time from parents to be able to go back and forth and haul their kids all around. And that makes it sort of an upper income kind of an issue. So that was my example, is all.
No, that's both of what you said and what Harvey said are good examples of how we differ from one another. If we're using this in the DEI space, how does diversity show up? What are we talking about when we say diversity, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Okay, everyone, help me answer that. So I guess you have to step back and discover how you can get people included at an earlier age, and change habits so that the diversity becomes less noticeable. It's so that you do be able to get more people involved. Anyone else with an idea about that? Oh, we have another person coming up.
Okay, great.
So you asked for a definition of diversity. To me, diversity is just a room full or a plate full of differences, different representations of food or people or backgrounds. But in our work in life, in the work of DEI or DIE, there's a new acronym, but anyway, in the work of diversity and equity, it is finding those who have been left out and including them, and making the group more diverse by including those who have traditionally been left out. And that would be as an educator, as an admissions officer, that diversity was bringing in what we didn't have to make the group more richer. And that would be bringing in students of color, students of different gender backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. That to me would be a diverse student body.
Okay, does anyone else have any thoughts about that?
Connie?
Yes,
Can you hear
please, Rose.
Yeah, I agree with this lady who just left the mic, that diversity certainly does mean the social background, the ethnic background, genders, sexual orientation, inclusive of all those things. And that makes up for having this diverse group. So to me, diversity is inclusive of all these things. And I guess that's it from my point of view.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rose. And everything that Harvey, you and Lynn have said, and everyone else who has spoken, certainly does fit into the pot of what diversity is. And it's important for us to understand that we're using the word, how we're using the word. And so let me show you some of the definitions that have popped up. That diversity is whenever two people get together, and whoever was talking about, you know, people in a room or food on a plate, that's different. No two people are alike. They have different life experiences, which result in seeing things in this world differently. And differences among people with respect to age, class, ethnicity, and so forth that you all have raised. So this is the definition of diversity. And in this DEI space, when we're trying to achieve diversity, we're trying to bring people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, et cetera, into whatever the organization or that we're talking about. So that's how this word is used. Does anyone have any thoughts about it or to add to this?
Connie, this is Maggie speaking. I'll just be really brief, but it also seems to me that one of the reasons diversity is so important is that we don't have a complete view when we only look at something from the point of view of one particular person or one particular kind of person.
Mhm.
So it's about a more accurate view of the world to see things more holistically.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And that is the importance of diversity. And that's one of the reasons we are so keen to create diversity in agencies and organizations. Absolutely, for these different perspectives.
Mhm.
Anyone else have any thoughts about diversity? I haven't noticed that there are any differences in how we see diversity, so that's great. We're on the same page on what diversity is and its importance. To get to what Rose and others were saying, these are various dimensions of diversity, and it's certainly not all, but these are the ways in which people differ. And it encompasses all the different characteristics that make one individual or group different from one another. And you'll see gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, education, parental status, and these become important depending on what the topic is that one is talking about, you know. Any thoughts on diversity?
Curious, religion isn't up there as one of those tenets. And I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Yes, religion is on here, should be. If it isn't, it is
Bottom.
on. Yes,
is.
right here, right here.
Middle though, which I find interesting.
Yes. Anything else anyone wants to share about diversity?
It's orange at the bottom. It's orange at the bottom, but I would look at that center.
I'm not hearing, if whoever's speaking, I'm not hearing.
See that it's at the bottom. I'm just curious here. So I see the things in the middle, which seem to be highlighted since they're in the middle. I do find it interesting that religion is not one of them that's in that middle. It seems to be a very important thing considering all the conflicts that occur over religion.
Yeah, well, the reason that the characteristics or the qualities in the middle are things that don't change about you, that this is who you are. And the things on the outside are things that vary, that can change, that are variable. But if you look at the things in the middle, that is who you are. And
Interesting.
that's why they're in the middle. That makes you unique. The things on the outside can change. Your marital status changes. Your parental status changes. Your race doesn't change. Right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
Makes sense.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions about this image or the concept of diversity? Okay, we will move on to talk about inclusion and belonging. And we have heard in the past that, you know, we focus on inclusion belonging is beginning to be a part of this discussion. And that's what one of the reasons I put it up here is so that we can talk about it. And if you've not become familiar with the importance of belonging, this will help. So I'd like you to think about your definition of inclusion and what does it mean to you? What is your definition of belonging and what it means? What does each look like in real life? An example, if you've experienced it, and what do you think is the difference between inclusion and belonging? So we've been talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't always talk about belonging. What's the point here?
It seems that belonging would be that you're comfortable there. It's a place of comfort. You're not just in the room, you're comfortable in that room and you're valuable in that room.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Anyone else? So what does inclusion mean as opposed to belonging then? Karen, would you like to add to that?
Well, inclusion is being invited into the room and being in the room, but it gets you in the room. But I guess it's that same thing about comfort or maybe automatically feeling like you should be there.
Okay.
This is Bill McCarskey. I think sometimes you can say how a person feels is whether you have a sense of belonging. I think it's also being accepted by the other group is an important feeling of belonging. You know, if someone has an idea and it's poo-pooed by the rest of the group, you really are not accepted yet. Necessarily. So that's my take. It's just not a feeling that you have. It's a feeling of others.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Thoughts about inclusion and belonging?
Connie,
Yes.
I guess I look at inclusion as being, if I walk, I could probably do better by giving an example and then maybe I can come back. But if I walk into a room full of people, well, no, let's just say a group of 5, and I make the 6th person, and I can walk in some instances, and I can feel that I am going to be inclusive, that I am going to be involved just by the presence of them, whatever the reception is that they give me. If I walk in, the first thing, the mannerly thing would be, because I'm walking in, would be someone say, "Hi, Rose," you know, even though they may not know me. If I don't get that kind of reception, that sometimes will make me feel like I may not belong and I may not be inclusive in this group. And I've actually worked with some people on some committees, and I have felt that. And when I do, then I just disassociate myself with that, because if I'm not feeling that from the beginning, I don't think I would be feeling that at the end. So for me, inclusion and belonging to a group, they are almost the same. They kind of go together. And it's important when we work with different organizations to allow people to feel that, if we really feel that ourselves. Because if we do, then it comes out and it's expressed, and that person will be the recipient of your kindness to them.
Okay, thank you, Rose. Anyone else have any thoughts or examples?
I think this is Frances Forster. I have a son who's has autism, and I feel like often when he would be included, quote unquote, in a general ed classroom, he didn't belong there. He was included, and it was a token gesture of just putting him in the room so they could say he was in the room with the normal kids. But he's pretty severely autistic, and it was not an effective place for him to learn. So it's sort of a different take on it.
Oh, Actually, it's an important take because you use the word token, and that's a word that has come up historically. You know, if you feel like you're the token Black person or you're the token woman in a place, you've been included, but you're not really belonging, right?
Right.
They have achieved their diversity goal because you're there, you've been included, but you don't belong. And so, and with, you know, disabilities are the same. People with disabilities, the same.
And in fact, my first job I got because I was female. I mean, this was back in the 70s. I got a job with Bell Labs, and they were having a problem with the equal opportunity people because they didn't have enough women. I was not qualified for the job. I was qualified by the time I finished.
Mhm.
You know, and I rose to the occasion, but I definitely got the job because I was female.
Yeah, so you were the token.
Yeah, I was the token, but I eventually, belonged.
Yes, and that is why we're having this discussion, because you can achieve your diversity goal. You can include people who you didn't have before, but if they don't feel like they belong, they will not stay. They don't feel engaged. They are not part of, you know, the organization, and you will lose them. But depending on the culture of the organization and how one is made to feel, you could eventually be that. But this is something to think about and work on. So I'm sorry,
Inclusion,
go
to
ahead.
me, inclusion is something that's easy to achieve
Mhm.
because you just include someone. But it's the step to get you to belonging. You have to, in my mind, in some instances, you have to go through the inclusion to get your foot in the door, and then work with the group and become part of the group, and then feel that you truly belong there. Inclusion is easy. Belonging is much more difficult.
Yes. Any other thoughts?
Mine's a personal experience of just a few days ago. We went to a memorial service from a teenager who had killed herself.
Hmm.
She had changed schools in the fall from an elementary school to a junior high. So I guess she automatically belonged, but she certainly wasn't included. She was bullied. She was ambivalent about her sexuality, and ultimately, just 10 days ago, she took her own life.
Hmm.
And so she definitely was not feeling belonging. And it breaks my heart in many ways, because I think this is true so much of young people today, and all of us to some degree, because there are lots of places we can go and be quote unquote included because we're the right race, the right age, the right job, whatever it is. But to have a sense of belonging, you have to work your way to that, and people have to invite you to, really belong. And that's when you feel like this is home to me. And I think we have a trouble with that in our daily lives everywhere, not just here in Easton or the United States. I think it's probably something that leads the whole world into bad experiences. So it's very important. And I don't have any answers, by the way.
Yes, but thank you for sharing. That's a sad story, and unfortunately, you know, it happens much too often. Rose, were you about to say something else?
Maybe I'll let it go until later. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Anyone else want to talk about inclusion and belonging? So let's look at what the literature says. I'm sorry? Did someone try to speak? Okay, I guess I was hearing background noise. Okay, so these are some definitions of inclusion: the act of including, the state of being included, the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded as because of their race, gender, sexuality, or ability. So this is the definition that we are familiar with and have been talking about. Inclusion is authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into processes, activities, and decisions, policymaking in a way that shares power. That's an important piece right there, that in a way that shares power, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So inclusion means everyone, and you'll see all kinds of images here. Now, belonging is to be part of or in natural association with something, to be a member of a group, to have a suitable or appropriate place. It's an affinity for a place or situation, the feeling of security and support when there is a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity for a member of a certain group or place. Any thoughts on any of these definitions as I'm reading through them? Do they resonate? Okay. But what we do know that belonging, as some of you have spoken about, belonging is a fundamental human need, something that every human is wired to want. We want to be needed. We want to feel like we belong. The feeling of being a part of something and mattering to others. The feeling that one can make a meaningful contribution and that others value your work. I heard someone say that earlier about being valued in a space. And this is what belonging is. It is a feeling of being accepted for who you are.
Connie, this is
Yes.
Jody. This is
Yes.
Jody.
Yes.
None of this is going to work until people who are being included, whether it's affirmative action or quotas or whatever, until they feel, like you said, that they are supported. And the thing that we all have to do is to learn how to listen to others with different opinions, coming from different perspectives and communities, and give those people the respect and not only listen to them, but support them in what it is that they're suggesting or whatever their contribution is. People aren't, as you said, aren't going to stay in a group unless the group takes some participation in supporting those persons. So the onus is really on us, the people that are already part of the group.
Yes, absolutely. And it is something that, you know, it's going to take effort, take courage, take all the things that you listed, Dodie, because the research is showing that in organizations and in groups, people don't stay if they don't feel like they belong. Their engagement in the activities of whatever the organization or the business or the group is lacking because they don't feel like they belong.
Connie, I'd love to hear your take on the idea that, because certainly as an educator, I've tried to do this. If someone is in a situation where they don't feel they belong or included, what role do they have in changing that? Obviously, as the last speaker talked about, the group accepting them and all that. But if you feel that, if you walk, as Rose said, you walk into that room and you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason, what can you do? What is your role in trying to go from being excluded to included or not belonging to belonging? Because I think that's something that is at least as an educator, I feel is important to share with kids and others.
That's a very good question, Harvey, and I will ask the group for any thoughts about it. Do you feel like the person who is entering the organization, the classroom, has any responsibility for creating the sense of belonging, or is it all on the receiving group or agency or organization? What do you think? And what could that person do if you feel that they do have some responsibility? What could they do?
Well, and this is Rose speaking, but as a person, as a former social worker, I tend to talk. And if I'm feeling displaced, if I'm feeling that I don't belong to the group, I would go to a person, whoever the chairperson is or the president is, and just let them know that I'm not feeling a part of, and to let them know what my reasons are for not feeling a part of. So I think belonging is a second step, because I think the first step is feeling included or being inclusive. And then after you are feeling the inclusiveness, then you can move on to belonging, hopefully, if the group allows you to do that. But I think if I'm feeling uncomfortable with a situation, I usually talk and I verbalize that.
Okay, thank you, Rose. Yes, Norman.
To me, inclusion is can you hear me? Yeah. Inclusion is a one-way street. You can be included by invitation and you go there. To me, true belonging is a two-way street. It's the group that is asking you to come and the individual wanting to belong. And whatever the human dynamics to make that happen, to make that a two-way street come into play. And it's all kinds of things, I guess, but it's got to be mutual. Belonging, in my mind, is a mutual respect for each other, that you really belong there and are part of the group, as opposed to being included for numbers or whatever reason.
Okay. Any other thoughts about that?
This is Bill McCarthy again. Yeah, I too do agree with the gentleman who was just speaking. Sometimes you also have to listen to others and slowly gain their confidence and respect to feel like you belong. That's especially true in the technical world. You can be invited to a meeting, and if the group doesn't feel like you have anything to contribute, sometimes it's best to listen and take advantage of the time that's given to show that you can listen, and then volunteer some information. So the gentleman is right. It's just not a one-way street. It's multiple ways. It's two ways at least.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Robin Sterkoff. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Robin.
Okay, interesting question. I think there's shared responsibility, but it is not equal responsibility, because there is a power differential in these relationships. And in relationships where there's power differentials, the group that has the power has more responsibility to create that sense, that opportunity for somebody to step in and feel and experience true belonging. So I think there's shared responsibility, but I don't think there's equal responsibility.
Great point, Robin. Great point.
And I agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's take a look at this. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Peggy, and the way I feel belonging is if I'm in a new group, I volunteer and I get involved. So I see it as my personal responsibility to share. And then if I don't feel belonging, then I opt out. And I think many people do that, but that's one way.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So let's take a look at this slide where it says belonging is a feeling, the extent to which people can show up in a situation fully without having to sacrifice meaningful aspects of their identity. It's about creating an environment where people feel like this is my place, a place where people feel respected, where they can contribute and make a difference. Does this sit well with you all? Does it fit with what we've been talking about?
Mhm.
So it is a two-way street, but in the end, I want to feel like this is where, I am respected, where I can be myself. I don't have to fit in by changing myself to be like the rest of the group. I fit in because what I bring to the table is important for the group and is going to help the group, the agency, the organization do what it needs to do. So accept me for who I am, not because I've changed to become who you are, but because of who I am. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Actually, I want to say something. This is Elaine. I'm going to start my video. I was eating lunch. I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. It's lunchtime.
I don't quite agree with that. I feel that if you're going to be in a group, you do have to compromise.
Mhm.
In other words, that's the law of society. If we all went around just being ourselves, if I were just totally myself, maybe no group would really want me, depending on depending on what day of the week it is. And I could give you a couple examples, but I won't. I'm thinking of church and groups, etc. And in other words, there's a culture in every group. I worked in the accounting field and I worked at FDIC. We had a completely different culture there than I did when I worked in the private sector, where it was more dog eat dog. And so you, as a social person, you have to understand what the culture of that group is. So in other words, I'm just saying there are nuances to that statement that you're not going to sacrifice. Of course, it says meaningful aspects, so that's true. But you're going to, it seems to me, you will have, in order just to, you're going to have to conform in some ways in order to have them fully accept you.
Yes, no, thank you for that. And it's good to have a sort of a different take on these things. That's what conversations are all about. But yes, noticing that this is sacrificing meaningful aspects of their identity where people can feel respected. And if you're going to go in and act, and I don't know what you said you do, that people would kick you out, but I don't think those would be, that would be behavior that would be respected, and it may not be meaningful aspects of your identity. It's something that shows up in that moment. But again, these are, statements to be interpreted in whatever way is meaningful for you. But this is what, some people think belonging is, and how much you choose to compromise, how much you choose to give up part of what makes you unique to belong is up to you. It really is up to you. And will you be happy with it? How much are you willing to do to be part of the group? It's your decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think where I worked, we had affirmative action going on, and we had mixed feelings about it. And by and large, it worked well. But let's just give an example. Let's say most everybody in this particular group went to a certain kind of college and got this similar degree, and then somebody is brought in, like you said earlier, sort of like not a token, but affirmative action. And that person went to a different college, and maybe it was a Southern historically Black college, whatever. That person, and what I've seen is that person almost has to prove themselves. Do you know what I mean? In other words, just because, oh, I have this degree from so-and-so, this person may have to come in and say, I have this degree from so-and-so, and I'm just as valuable as you are. But there are going to be people in the group that are going to be a little reluctant to accept that right away.
Mm-hmm. So in that scenario, who do you think needs to do the changing?
Well, in that scenario, it's the group that is welcoming this person and understanding the contributions
Right.
that the person is making. In other words, having an open mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Being respectful and accepting the people as they are for whatever HBCU they've been to. They have a degree, they have, been hired and to do the work. So how does that culture make these people feel welcome and comfortable? That's the issue here. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Anything else? I mean, we could continue talking about this, but we won't get to the other other words that we have. But that's part of the problem. There's so many words that we need to really clarify, and we don't have as much time as we might need. So, is there anything else about belonging, inclusion, diversity? Those are the three words that kind of go together. And I think someone, well, this
Yeah,
is I'm sorry. Yes, Norman?
I guess from my experience, to me, the most important thing that I found from diversity effort was to get diversity of thought. So, it was more of people's experiences. Let's take in the accounting realm. I'm not an accountant, but in some realm, it's how they would approach the problem and how that adds to the group. Is important as well. So to me, a very important aspect of this is getting people that think differently, because their experiences are entirely different.
Yes.
And you see different ways of approaching things that are beneficial.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to ask Harvey, did we touch on your question and give you an answer?
Yes, Connie, thank you.
Okay.
It's not an easy one, but I think, a lot of thoughts about, if you don't feel you're belonging, taking honest steps. I think what Rose said about expressing your feelings, don't hold them in, is important, as long as you can do it in a way that's respectful of the group. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. That's a whole nother conversation about how to do that. Okay, so let's just because someone was alluding to something very similar to what these slides is. Diversity is having a seat at the table. You can see that there's a diverse group sitting at this table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table, being able to speak up and say what needs to be said. And belonging is having your voice heard and appreciated. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Hey,
Okay.
Connie,
Yes.
Would you tilt your camera a little bit? The label of your name is covering half of your face.
I don't know it. Okay.
A little bit easier to see and hear, maybe.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we're going to move to talking about equality and equity, because these words sometimes are used interchangeably, and I'd like to know how you define them. Do they mean the same thing? If not, how they're different? Give an example of how they're used in the discourse on race and racism, and what does a racially equitable society look like? Any thoughts? Equality and equity, they are used sometimes interchangeably. What do you think?
I remember your previous example from another discussion.
Okay, Annabelle.
Of the fence. And there's hills and valleys on this side. Yeah, that yes. And yeah, that guy in the wheelchair, that box isn't doing him any good at all. But equity is providing what each person needs, and the needs may be quite different. The guy in the red shirt doesn't need any help. He can see over the fence just fine. The others need a little assistance to see over that fence. And I've come back to that thought many times. I didn't know you were about to come up with this picture. But yes, I keep coming back to that and thinking the one on the right is really equity, because it's giving each what they require to see over the fence.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Annabelle. So you were listening the first time. Does anybody else have any thoughts about this? And do you see what we've been talking about? What's the difference between equality and equity? And in this conversations that we have about race and racism, as I said, these words are used interchangeably sometimes. So any thoughts?
It's a good example.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want us to be clear on what the difference is and why there is a difference. That, as Annabelle said, that each person may need something different to be able to achieve what they need to achieve in life. And if we give everybody the same thing, that's not going to work. We need to give them according to their needs. So this is another aspect of this, or another view of this whole thing. They've added justice now, and as you can see, with the justice, let's see, with the justice, there is no, you can see through the fence, and so the kid, this short person, this tall person, everybody can see, but from their own vantage point. Any thoughts on these two images? Anybody else? Does this surprise you? And Annabelle has seen this before. I think Rose has seen it before. Anybody else? Is this new to you? This difference?
Yes, it is to me. I think equity is a word that has emerged in the past few years. Equality was the word that was used back, starting in the 60s. Congress of Racial Equality, et cetera. And I just started seeing equity being used recently. So I'm glad you're explaining this to us.
Yes, yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts about this?
Connie, this is Maggie speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think this is really such an important distinction, because I think not understanding this distinction lies at the core of a lot of the resistance to racial change, in that people think we're asking everybody to be equal, or we're all never going to be equal. And I think what people often don't understand is the different needs that different people have to be able to have opportunities in this world, because it's not a level playing field. And so to me, the distinction in these three concepts really cuts to the core of some of the challenge that's ahead of those of us who want to work for more racial justice.
Yes,
So I
indeed.
really appreciate the images.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And this is, someone mentioned affirmative action earlier. Where do you think affirmative action fits into this picture?
Fence you can see through.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
Who's responsible for making a see-through fence?
Okay, the question was, who is responsible for making a see-through fence? Good question. Anybody have any thoughts?
All of us.
Okay. Any conversation about that?
I think that when we, in different situations where there are different population of different cultures, especially people of color. I think that if we let some of our guards down and we just see people as people, then I think we can be better people overall. I just think that, you know, if we stop being so guarded, we see people who are different from us and just see people.
Okay, hold that thought, Rose, because that is a perfect segue into my next one that we're going to talk about in a minute. But I just want to, I don't want to cut anybody off. If you have any thoughts about equality, equity, and justice.
This is Bill McCarskey again.
Yes.
Sometimes I think there's a resistance of people naturally to deal with equity. They feel like certain people are being given an advantage over others.
Exactly.
Whereas justice is easier for people to accept, from my perspective anyway.
Okay. Any thoughts about that? Bill said that, Mr. McCarskey said that it's easier to accept the open fence than to give people what they need, for how I understand it. This is.
Well, it's our society, our culture is based a lot on competition and how to get that my phone now.
No.
Competition and how to get ahead and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, and a lot of people think that way.
Okay.
Connie, this is Lynn.
Yes, I'm trying to stop this phone. Okay, I apologize. Go ahead.
So I really like the idea that the way you've illustrated justice. My takeaway, and I want to check and make sure that I'm taking this correctly. My takeaway from what you've said is that justice is when everyone is equal without having to have anything. Oh man, I'm losing it now. Yeah.
I mean, it's like you have equality, which people, okay, everybody's getting the same thing, but it doesn't serve the purpose. You have equity where some people think that others have more of an advantage or are given an advantage, which puts you at a disadvantage. Then you have justice, which all of that goes out the door, because everybody's getting
is equal.
Everybody's getting equal in the idea that what they're getting is the barrier has been removed.
And what struck me was the question that the educator asked earlier about, well, how do we make that work for a kid that comes into the classroom and they're different in whatever way, and how do we help them, or what do we need to tell them to do? And I guess really the conclusion that I arrive at in here is that we have to take away the fences so that they are a part of the group, which often means taking a leadership role of maybe introducing them in such a way so everyone else sees how they're, what they bring to the table, or I don't know. Are we? Oh, good. Here's somebody else coming in.
You're making me think of 7 million other things. I worked in private school admission and financial aid, and this illustrates for me the challenge we always had. Equality, you've got these 3 brilliant kids and you offer them all admission. Equity is, how do you make sure they can come? Who needs financial aid? But then the other piece is the justice is you don't see all their need, not just financial aid, but they can't pay for their books, or they don't have a parent who can get them to the school that's not on a public transportation route. I had an experience with a child an amazing, bright kid who we got a full scholarship into college. He had no money for books, and unbeknownst to us, his support team, he went to the library and was borrowing his textbooks and keeping them for long periods to get through the term. And letters were being mailed to his home address where there was no one there. He really didn't have parents. that said, if you don't bring the books back or pay the fines, you can no longer be enrolled in this university. Out of the blue, he gets notification that he is no longer a student there and didn't know why. So sometimes the justice, we can't see where the blockage is. And that's when things are really not just, you know, when you can't see the boundaries to help or to make it more equitable. And what is justice? You know, that's really hard, you know. Quickly, the support team jumps in and gets back to equity, giving him what he needs. But it's hard when you don't even know a third of the boundaries that are thrown up against someone.
Yes, yeah, very good point. Thank you for making that point. But these are all things that we need to be cognizant of and aware of, things that are going on, and how we can help to make things better. Any other thoughts on equality, equity, and justice? We certainly can't exhaust the conversation about it, but at least we've made a start, and we can continue in another venue. We have to move on now to, let's see, get this out of my way. So we just did this. Equality has to do with giving everyone the exact same resources. Equity involves distributing resources based on the needs of the recipients. Okay. Now, so Rose, to what you were just saying earlier about, do you want to repeat what you said about treating people?
Hope I can remember. I was simply saying, I think that in some instances, when we're faced with situations with people of color, and we have, well, let's say a job position, and we have to look at that position and those people as just that, people based, and if they have the qualifications for a specific job classification, then we have to look at it not as people as with color, but just people, just see people as people. You know, we base our conclusions on just people and the qualifications for which we're looking for. And I think in a lot of instances, we should do that. We just should take away the skin color and just see people as people and base it on that. I think that's important. And I think I'm afraid that in some instances that does not happen, but it should.
Okay, thank you. As I said, that takes us very well into the next concept, which is color blindness. So I'd like to know what your definition of color blindness is, and what does it mean to you? What does it look like in real life? What is its impact? What does being colorblind do? So Rose, were you talking about this as being colorblind? Was that's what I took away from what you said?
Yes, yes.
All right. So what do you all think about, the rest of you think about being colorblind in the society that we live in? What does colorblindness look like? Rose has given us a good introduction. Any other thoughts?
Well, it looks like the audition for the symphony, which is done most often behind a curtain, so that the people selecting cannot see the person at all.
Okay, I didn't hear everything. Could you get closer to the mic?
I said an example of color blindness would be an audition by a violinist or someone for the symphony, which in many cases is done behind a curtain. And the people selecting the musicians don't get to see them at all. Do it on the basis of their work, the music they make.
Okay. You have to be, I can't hear you.
But doesn't that risk ignoring this needs of special groups?
Okay, the question is if being colorblind, is that ignoring the needs of the group that we're talking about, the special needs of the group? What do you think about being colorblind?
Well, it's not just the needs of the special group. You really don't see you don't see the whole person. So I'm going to go the opposite. And I'm going to say that you want to see what the person is made of. You want to see who they are and how rich their background is, whether it's your gender or your color or how you stand or what your accent is. That's all a part of who you are. So how can you not see that?
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Rose, what do you think about that?
I was just sitting here thinking, it's wonderful that Karen thinks that way, but that's not always the reality either. And I could speak from my perspective. It's just not always true in certain instances. I like your perspective, but it's just not always true.
I don't think that there's the word colorblind, which sounds great, but I think the reality is completely different. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of colorblindness. The idea is that you see it, but it doesn't affect what you're going to, what your decisions are, how you're going to behave. Now, I don't think that's a reality that people do that, because in fact, look, I'm looking at Rose, she's different than me. But do I care that she's different than me? No, I don't. But to say that I don't see that is crazy. Of course I see that. Okay. You see that with people with disabilities. You're going to say that person has a disability. You're not going to see the disability. You're going to see the disability. But are you going to, is it going to factor into all the major decisions that you're going to make in your interaction with that person? That's your choice as to whether you're going to do that. And I'm hoping that you don't do that.
Okay. All right. So colorblindness is something that, I'm sorry, is someone speaking that I don't see? No. Colorblindness is something that, maybe we've been taught, as we were growing up, not to see color, but to see the person, etc. And, it's part of the values that our parents might have taught us. But in fact, let's just see. This is what some people say, that the racial ideology that posits the best way to end discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. This is what the literature says about colorblindness in the context of what we've been talking about. And that's what, some of you have been saying. But as Karen and others have said, colorblindness taken in that context denies the negative racial experiences of people of color, rejects their heritage, and invalidates their unique perspectives. If you don't acknowledge somebody for who they are, their race, their whatever other differences that they may have. And so this is another way to look at colorblindness, as something that's not helpful.
I know I've seen statistics. I've heard that example about the violinists having to audition from behind a curtain. So the team, whoever it is that's evaluating them, see who they are. And apparently they actually started doing something of that sort. And I'm not sure which symphony orchestra this would be, but they actually used that. And what they found was they started hiring a lot more women, because when they looked at them, when they could see who they were, they might have said, no, we're not evaluating on gender, but they were hiring a higher percentage of men. And with the curtain there, the percentage of women greatly increased. So there's something subconscious about it that they may think they're being fair, but clearly they weren't, because when they were just evaluating on the basis of the playing, it changed the outcome.
And again, you guys are wonderful, because this is a wonderful segue into the next thing that we're going to be talking about, which is implicit or unconscious bias. And that example that was just given about the auditions for the orchestra, etc., there's another piece to that story, in that in one particular orchestra did that audition that way, and but they had to make a change, because they were auditioning men and women, and yes, the men were getting accepted and so forth, but the women weren't, and in the beginning. And the reason that was is because those the judges who were auditioning the applicants could hear the click of their heels in the back of the curtain, and they knew they were women. So this implicit unconscious bias was working. No, this is serious. Read Malcolm Gladwell. This is in his book, and it is a true story, that they could hear the high heels of the women auditioning in the back, and that affected the way that they heard what was being played. So unconscious or implicit bias is at work. So what do you, and I'm looking at the clock, we have about 15 minutes. What is your definition of unconscious or implicit bias? What does it look like in real life? I just gave you an example. How have you experienced it? Anybody? What is implicit or unconscious bias?
Connie, I can answer that. It's the, I mean, the concept itself kind of defines itself. So there are things that we're not aware of that give us preferences that we're just not. I'm trying to not define something by using the word conscious. It's impossible. But they are things that of which we are unaware, but yet shape our perceptions and evaluations of other people, knowingly or not.
Yes, 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 yes. There it is. Bias that we are unaware of and which happens outside of our control. It is a bias that happens automatically and is triggered by our brain, making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations, influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. Does anybody know how this happens? What triggers unconscious bias? We've heard about the high heels. Anything else? Any other examples? Any other thoughts? What happens?
I have one. And I'm ashamed of myself, but this is what happened. I saw a big Mercedes, black Mercedes, and two black men in the front. And I said to myself, they must be drug dealers. So shame on me, but that's a perfect example, I think.
I think another example is our norms and our values that we inherit from our families, from our parents. And when we do that unconsciously, those upbringings can have an effect on how we treat others or how we see others unconsciously.
Yes, yes. You see, influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. Absolutely. I mean, you all probably know the research about the research when companies were given, or a company was sent a bunch of resumes to be considered for a particular role, and the qualifications in the resumes were exactly the same. What was different were the names on the resumes. Some names sounded, quote, white. Some names sounded like African-American names, Letitia and whatever. And some names were Asian sounding. And who do you think got the request for interviews or the invitation to interviews? It was overwhelmingly those resumes who carried the names of people with names that sounded, quote, white. Again, this is an example of how unconscious bias could work in an organization, in an agency. When you're hiring people, you pay attention to those kinds of things. There's another story of a guy who is hiring for a position on his team, and he's looking at all these resumes, and he comes across while he's tired. He's been looking at resumes, for a couple of hours now. He's tired. He comes across a resume, and he said, "Oh wow, this person went to the school that he went to and belonged to the fraternity that he belonged to," and he accepted that resume, even though the person was not fully qualified for the role. But again, unconscious bias. We do this, we go to things that are familiar to us. So I'm going to show you how that, okay, these are a couple of other biases. You can see some of the things that if we hear a foreign accent, or we see somebody with disability, all kinds of things based on the diversity of whomever we're looking at. But I wanted to show you this image of the brain and how these biases happen. Our brains use two thinking systems that operate simultaneously. And this other, that's not there. When we get stimuli into our brain that go through our brain stem and come here into our limbic system, we feel before we think. So we have an emotion about something before we actually think about it. And so because, and here's some facts, our subconscious mind absorbs over 1 billion pieces of information per second. Think of all that information that's going into our brain. We have to have a way to categorize that. The average person today perceives 65,000 more bits of information and stimuli per waking day than his or her ancestors did a century ago. So we as humans have a limited information processing capability. We are getting the billions of pieces of information bombarding our brains. And that is why less than 1% of what comes in ever reaches our conscious mind, because we have to filter out 99% of that. And so the question is, how do we filter that out? We filter it out based on the things that we were just talking about. Come on. We take mental shortcuts based on things that we know about, things that from our background, from our cultural environment, and so forth. We categorize people because it's a shortcut. And we make decisions, we make quick decisions about them because we have to filter out all that information that comes in. And so we do it by stereotype, we do it by things that we've known before. So biases we're wired to have biases. This wiring creates a set of systematic thinking errors. Biases are learned through culture and experiences, and they are contextual. But it's all because the way our brains work, we have something in our brains called the amygdala, which is the oldest part of our brain. And it helped our ancestors to stay safe. It was a protection for how to decide who to let into the group, how to protect themselves against saber-toothed tigers and so forth. It was the alarm system in our brain. So when we are faced with something that's different, our alarm system goes off and we have to do something about it. And before it gets to our prefrontal cortex, which is up here, which is the logical thinking brain, all of this thing happens here in the limbic system where the amygdala lives, where we have an emotion, and it's either fear and we have to make a decision, Are we going to be afraid of this thing, or are we going to accept it as okay? And when we are faced with something different, we first have an emotion that might be fear, and then we have a split-second decision to make about whether we're going to let our amygdala be in charge, or whether we're going to let our prefrontal cortex be in charge. And all of this is happening when we are putting people in categories. Are they part of us? Are they not part of us? And if we let the amygdala in our limbic system be in charge, we're going to have a different kind of reaction than if we have our prefrontal cortex or executive brain in charge, where we make a logical decision about this person. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So this is where the bias comes in, because we are wired to be biased, and so to be aware of these biases, we can do something about it. But if you have an unconscious bias, you're not aware of it by definition. And so we might want to be thinking about how to become aware of our unconscious bias. And there is, by the way, a test that has been developed by two Harvard scientists called the implicit bias test. So if you're interested in finding out what your implicit biases might be, you can look up the implicit bias test, which was developed, as I said, by some Harvard scientists. Any thoughts, any questions? So just keep this in mind about how our brains work. And again, this could be a whole conversation by itself. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into it any more depth, but you now have some things that you can look up yourself. So biases form the invisible lenses through which we all subconsciously see the world. So accepting your own biases as well as others involves understanding that bias is a natural, inevitable part of human cognition. It's not unique to you, your company, or your employees. And not all biases are bad. That's the other thing that we want to know. Any thoughts, any questions before we move on? Okay. Intersectionality, another word that pops up when we're talking about race. And I'd like you to think about what you know about it, but I'm going to share the definition just because we're about to run out of time. But intersectionality is a prism to see the interactive effects of various forms of discrimination and disempowerment. It looks at the way that racism many times interacts with patriarchy, heterosexism, classism, xenophobia, all those things, seeing that the overlapping vulnerabilities created by these systems actually create specific kinds of challenges. So it's how all of these different isms and forms of discrimination overlap. Because if you're a woman and you're Black and you're gay, those are three things that overlap. The intersectionality of those three things can have an impact on you and how you show up in the world and how you accept it in the world. So this word is important. Microaggression is another word that pops up. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into much detail about it, but just to put it on your radar, something to think about. Microaggression, the standard definition for that is a verbal or nonverbal slight that impacts an individual who might identify as being from a marginalized or non-mainstream community. So what does a microaggression look like? Here are some examples. So you're looking at someone and you're talking to them and they, you ask them, where are you from? And they say, I'm from Kansas. No, where are you really from? You speak such good English. And it happens, right? No,
Yes.
Where are you really from? Somebody says to you, a credit to your race. You're so articulate. Or you ask an Asian person to help with a math or a science problem. I mean, these are stereotypes, right? A white man or woman clutching their purse or checking their wallet as a Black or Latinx person approaches or passes. A store owner following a customer of color around the store. crossing the street when a person of color approaches. When I look at you, I don't see color. America is a melting pot. Or you're an African-American young person and somebody says, can I touch your hair? And so all of these other, couple of other things. But these are examples of microaggressions that you might even be aware that you're doing them, but this is how it feels. Privilege is another concept that that pops up. What does it mean? What does it look like? It's an unearned social power accorded by the formal and informal institutions of society to all members of a dominant group. White privilege, male privilege. Privilege is usually invisible to those who have it because we're taught not to see it, but nevertheless, it puts them at an advantage over those who do not have it. Here are some examples. If I'm white, I can walk through certain neighborhoods without being stopped or asked questions. When people describe me, they don't refer to the color of my skin. I can walk down a street without attracting negative or positive attention because of my race. I don't have to worry about people, especially males in my life, being harassed by the police simply because of their race, unless I'm in a multiracial relationship. If I commit a crime, I'm assured that I will not be considered a disgrace to my race. I can go to a restaurant or other establishments, and if I get poor service, I don't have to wonder if it's because of my race. These are just some examples of what is considered white privilege. Any thoughts on these? I'm sorry? Is that someone speaking? Okay, just background noise again. Okay. Any thoughts on these last three concepts? And again, this will give you something to go back and do some more research on, unfortunately, because we don't have time to get into them in detail. So these are a few other words that probably need to be discussed as well. Allyship, white supremacy, social justice, prejudice, critical race theory, which is, as you know, in the news, white fragility. What does BIPOC mean? Black and Indigenous people of color. Black Lives Matter, model minority. What is a model minority? Stereotype, othering. These are all terms that still need to be discussed at some point, somehow. Okay, I think we have reached it's 1:59 according to my clock. Any parting comments or thoughts before we close down? I do appreciate all of you participating and really having a good conversation. Even though it's Zoom and personal, it worked.
Thank you, Connie.
Connie.
All right, any thoughts? Okay, well, maybe we can continue this conversation in another venue somehow. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Connie.